In this video lecture, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of both social movements as a big general category, describing how different groups of people come together to resist domination, and then also this concept of legality narratives to help you understand the consciousness, the way that people think and communicate with one another that leads them to resist domination. I've pulled some lyrics from a Ben Harper song, Get Up, and I think one way of framing this is just to think about domination as an abuse of authority or holding somebody down, or as Ben Harper is describing here, the law has broken me. So you see this kind of dominant use of the law. Sometimes people call it an illiberal or authoritarian use of the law. But then on the opposite side, you see Ben Harper here using law in a different way as well. Also that I have a right, right? So you've got this kind of struggle between law as rights and that I can kind of advocate for myself and to advocate for others to go ahead and go against the law as domination. And so this is how you want to think about this lecture as kind of a two-sided dilemma. The two sides of the dilemma are what create these three different stories about law. And when we talk about beliefs and stories in an organized way, we call this a narrative. This is a story that someone or a group of people is using in order to explain and make meaning out of how they experience legal structures, including police, the courts, contracts, property law, all the different aspects that kind of come up in everyday life. So a lot of people, and if you look at this image here on the right, it's going from top to bottom, before the law, with the law, against the law, as these different narratives, these different stories that people tell. And people tend to tell different stories at different times. So it's not like you believe in one, you keep that for your whole life. But it tends to change based on your experience with legal institutions. Normativity means this is the reason for, the purpose for the thing that we believe is the right thing. A belief system that's based in what we want to be normal, or we want to be the norm. Constraint is the thing that they see as holding law in, or legal authority within. Capacity is the opposite of that, right? That's the thing that allows for change to occur. Time space is pretty clear, I think, when and where this is occurring. And then the archetype is this belief in a perfect or absolute system that would best represent this narrative. So the first narrative is before the law, and this comes from a good example of this that kind of got scholars to think about it was from a literature piece called The Trial by Franz Kafka. And no matter what this individual did in this story, they seemed to be before the law. The law was always right there outside of them, and always kind of holding them in. There was nothing they could do. The law was always going to stop them. And so a lot of people see this to in the realm of policing. The policing is kind of the idea of before the law. There's nothing I can do because if I try to do something, there's going to be consequences for my behavior. And so in order to challenge this domination and of authority, someone would have to, from the inside, like have an inside source that would work within the policing structure, or within the governmental structure, or within a legal institution. They'd have to make the change on your behalf. And then the people who are suffering because of this system, we call the oppressed, there seems to be nothing that they can do. They need somebody from the outside to do this. So this is usually a narrative that explains inaction, right? Why people aren't resisting, or why they aren't organizing, or why they're not trying to make change in their life. They've seemed to have accepted domination. They've kind of just said, there's nothing I can do. This is the way it is. Life isn't fair. There might be something I can do, but I just can't get myself to do it. And so another strange part of this is that while people tend to think this is an abuse of power, they tend to still believe in the system. So they think the system is neutral, they think it's impartial, they think it's objective, they think it's a set of rules, they think that it's the absolute authority. A lot of you kind of talked about this when you just did a dictionary definition of sovereignty, from the Webster's dictionary kind of thing, or the Internet dictionary. It's very different than the kind of sovereignty that the judges were talking about, or what we mean in law. But people tend to have this kind of common sense idea that it's a bureaucracy, that it's good for them, and that it's separate from their everyday existence. That they're, it's like you go somewhere to law, and that's where you experience it, and there's nothing you can do. It's almost like if you went to a country and you didn't speak the language. There'd just be this magical place where you'd go in that country, and everything would be translated into English for you, and everything would be taken care of. If we drop down to up against the law, this is the total opposite then. Up against the law is more of people who are experiencing domination, and in this sense, it's not that the law is working for them or that it's objective or neutral. It's actually the opposite. It's biased. It's not helping them. It's not very clear. There doesn't seem to be rules that apply to everyone. Instead, it looks like there's hierarchy. Some people are treated better than others. There's inequality. Things like wrongful conviction, police abuse of power. All of these things are saying, the law isn't for me. I'm up against it. It's like coming at me, and there's, I have to resist it. So what people try to do as the archetype in this situation is, rather than see it as a bureaucracy, as a place to go, they try to avoid it, right? So they make do. They stay away from that place. They try to keep away from the law. They stay out of trouble, quote unquote. And this is their everyday life. So unlike the other belief system, this one says law's everywhere. It's constantly being reinforced, and it's constantly pushing up against me. And so this seems to require some kind of adaptation. So if you believe in this system, or you believe in this narrative, you'd start to adapt to the situation by avoiding those in power. And if you do resist, it will tend to come out in uncoordinated, informal, and sometimes even hidden, right? Underground, maybe rap lyrics, right? Different ways of expressing your resistance without physically organizing. The third one is the one that people who are just learning the law tend to have the hardest time with, and that's with the law. People who see with the law tend to be lawyers, they tend to be judges, they tend to be business people who use the law every day, and they see law as a tool in order to get what they want. And so they're quick to bring a lawsuit, they've gone to court many times, they know the rules of the game. They see the system as a game, and so it's not about a matter of who's right or who's wrong or who's telling the truth. It's an issue of who plays the game the best, who's got the best lawyers, who's the best prepared, who knows the system the best. And so in this way, this is based on individual experiences of winning and losing, right? The idea that the law is legitimate because it's helping me express my individuality, my goals, it's giving me my rational self-interest, and so I'm going to use it because it's useful to me, and if it's not, then I'll try to avoid it. And so you can see these kind of narratives blend with each other, they overlap, but there's also these kind of distinct experiences that make people have these beliefs. In sum, right, the law is not one thing, right? There's three different ways here that we've collected about human beings on how do they see the law, what do they think it is, particularly in the United States. So I want to start with this idea of people who, in their minds, right, in their belief system, they're accepting domination. They're saying that's the way it is. It is the way it is. There's nothing that I can do about it. And in some ways, they're kind of saying that domination is good. So if they see an instance of police brutality, they'll tend to say, well, that's just one bad person. When you give them statistics where you say, well, what about the thousands of bad actors in a system that seems to promote excessive use of force? Courts don't punish most officers. Most officers don't even make it to the courts, right? And so why is there a system out here that's promoting this? they seem to scratch their heads and say, well, the law has to do something about this. So you remember, they see change as something that's going to happen from the inside. So they want police to police police. They want judges to police judges, right? They want the system to work from the inside. So the problem with that, of course, is that the system isn't going to change from the inside. It's going to take pressure from outside the system in order to make that change. And so this is not, and it's also not a new problem, right? So police abuse of power is a 1,000-year, if not 2,000-year-old problem. It's not unique to the United States. Famously, the Nazi abuse of power in Germany, the Stalin abuse of power in Russia, right? The abuse of power right now by clerics in Iran. I mean, you can look all over the world and you see a historical trend where police abuse power. This is one of the reasons why you have the concept of checks and balances, is to check police power, to check people from abusing their power. That's not going to happen by the people with power. It's going to have to happen with the people who are powerless. And so what I'm really curious in as a legal scholar is, so how do people resist domination? We saw in the previous slides that sometimes it's, like I said, through rap lyrics, or maybe they write a poem, maybe they make a film, a documentary, maybe they have a meme on Twitter, or maybe they have a picture that they put on Instagram. But how are they doing this in their everyday life? How are they resisting the domination and excessive police force in particular? And how are they resisting this kind of abuse of law that's occurring? The other thing I'm curious about is what sparks resistance, right? So when you start to see mass protests, what's the thing that really got people to go from inaction to suddenly action, right? To getting outside, to going to the streets, to filing lawsuits, to organizing, to running for political office. What awakens in their mind or in their communities that starts to tell them that they need to do something. And then I'm interested in how people strategically and technically organize, right? Do they meet at somebody's house? Are they using the internet? Do they start a website? Do they march in the streets? How is rioting involved? What relationship does looting have with people who are pushed out of the economic system and don't have jobs? What elements are involved as far as other organizations that they're working with? Are they talking to government officials, right? Do they know police officers? Different questions of the literal, how do people organize? And then what do rights have to do with it? How does what's so-called rights talk come into play? Do they talk about rights? Do they talk about freedom, justice? Do they use this language, or do they say something else? And do we understand the politics of rights, right? That even when an organization or a group starts to form and they start talking about rights, they might mean different things. They might have different experiences. They might have different legal narratives. They have different power, right? Some have more power than others in these different organizations. And so we want to think about that as well. And then to finally understand that the narrative of up against the law means I have a right, right? So these are people who might have formally accepted domination, but now are saying, no, I have a right. And so now they're moving from before the law to up against the law. So I'm curious as to how that process happens. One of the books that we've studied in classes is The Hate U Give by Angie Thomas, which is giving a fictional account of something that happens in black communities every month, which is the abuse of excessive force by police officers. And this has been going on for over 200 years in the United States. And this does happen, of course, in other countries as well, where police abuse their power. And so I wanted to just pull out a few quotes that kind of show it's a fictional book, but it's linking to everyday real stories. And so, you see this movie still here, the picture of The Hate U Give. The film is very similar to what both Ferguson protests, the Trayvon Martin protests, and also the George Floyd protests, and then subsequently the Black Lives Matter movement. You see this kind of constant image of people going out to the streets with signs, and you see this confrontation with police, right? So, and in some cities like Portland and Seattle, it was much more a direct confrontation with the police. People were going to precinct headquarters and protesting outside there. In New York, is very organized. meaning there was a collaboration with the police, with some of the exceptions of the looting. If you compare it to other places, it was much more organized. Other places, it was much more random, and you'd see it kind of uncoordinated and kind of what some people say erupt, or it started like a spark or a fire. But the idea here is that people, you might think about it, oh, this is people, did this because they were upset. Well, of course, right? But what explains the 30 years before that? Well, they were still upset, but they weren't going out to the streets. So again, what causes people to suddenly make these changes? And then getting to the material resources that people need in order to sustain a prolonged protest goes to education, food, and security. And so one good example from the 30s up to the 70s were the Black Panthers, who provided, as you see here in this picture, free preschool meals, so breakfast program. And this is a way of educating people to organize and know their rights and to resist domination, but it's also providing material benefits, right? So food and a secure place to be, and this kind of solidarity, right? This group of people who might have otherwise not known, right, that they were having these similar struggles. Here they are, all in one place. And then finally, it's this idea of not being silent, right? That a group needs to organize in order to make change, and so the individual suddenly realizes that they have to be a part of that, or they have to make a choice. So how does this example from fiction, match other social movements in history? So I pulled two that I had seen and observed. I've been to a lot of marches and protests over the years, and so I pulled two that were from New York City. So one, you see the Climate Change March, and one from the Women's March. Both very diverse, and both with examples of kind of what we found in our research on social movements, which is that people generally have the same goals, right? That they have these kind of 2 or 3 things that they can put onto a sign, or that they can put into a chant, but how they think they're going to accomplish that thing, or what political groups they're in, or their gender, or their race, or their sex, or their ethnicity, or their cultural background, those things are different. So they have the same general idea, but they're very different in how they got to that idea and what they want to do about it. And there's always in social movement groups, there's always this kind of two approach, right? There's this two-prong approach. On the one hand, some people are advocating for lawsuits and going to courts and using the legal system as a way to punish or get restoration through that process. On the other hand, there's people who are arguing for more political action, whether that's putting pressure, whether that's on government, whether that's coming up with a media campaign, whether it's going to the streets, right? Whether it's organizing to provide education and healthcare and food. So there's this kind of combination of activities that are both formal law, they're about going through the courts or going through the political process, voting, things like that. And then there's also this other approach that's dedicated more to outside of that formal process. Another big commonality, as you'll see in both these pictures, is the understanding that race and class tend to overlap, meaning the way that poor people are treated is similar to that in racial injustice. And so people start to understand this, they start to have conversations about seeing that they have similarities in the way that they're being treated like second-class citizens. They're not getting all the advantages that democracy is saying that it's going to provide. And so they have a shared context. They start to have this ability to see each other's dilemmas as being similar. Gender is less involved in this. Sometimes it is directly involved. Black Lives Matter is a very good example of race, class, and gender being directly involved. But gender tends to get divided based on race. And so in our studies, right? So when we study social movement groups, we see women's groups tend to get dominated by white women in the United States in the political struggle, also educated women. So the issues of class and race tend to come up in gender-based social movements. The communication tends to be about rights, freedom, and justice, but these tend to have language that comes from historical struggles. So they learn from previous social movements. They use similar language. As you see here, the Green New Deal is a reference to the New Deal in the 30s. Some of these unite, my rights. These are references back to earlier movements, whether it was the progressive movement in the late 1800s, whether it was the women's movement, women's suffrage movement, the right to vote earlier in the century, or whether it's the civil rights movement for political equality in the 50s. They tend to learn from each other and use similar language. Regional practices matter. So like I said, activity in New York is different than California. It's different than Kansas. It's different than Florida. So kind of whatever traditions are going on in those areas, whether they're more focused on labor, maybe they're more focused on the environment, maybe they're more focused on urban issues, those definitely have an influence over how people think and talk about rights and what they think about injustice, as well as how they decide to confront. As I said, it was very interesting being in New York and Seattle, seeing Black Lives Matter marching down the street with dirt bikes and mopeds and motorcycles, at the front, like leading that long procession of people in a very orderly, mostly orderly manner, in a long march that they had coordinated with the police, and that police had responded to force people to go a certain direction, and then seeing Seattle and Portland, where there was really not much coordination. It was much more smaller groups of people kind of coming out of nowhere and bombarding police as they were going about their everyday business. So you saw very regional differences there between New York and the West Coast. There's also, people take advantage of political opportunities. So you might not have noticed, but at the time that Black Lives Matter come out is also at this time that you've got economic problems starting to arise, and you've got COVID, which is coming out, the pandemic. And so this is what's putting so much pressure on the system, where you can get a lot of attention because people who were not previously paying attention are suddenly paying attention. This usually happens after war. So you start to get racial justice movements among soldiers who come back from World War II that organize in the 60s. Protests against the Vietnam War. You get issues after large environmental disasters. So whether that's Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Sandy, or the Dust Bowl in the 30s, you get people organizing kind of around these really large-scale events. Globalization, war, these things kind of tend to bring people into a way of thinking about their struggles of injustice. So when we think then about this kind of historical narrative in the United States, if you're interested in social movements, or you're wondering how people organize against injustice, the kind of workbook or playbook is really organized around young people's movements, especially students, college students and high school students who participated in the Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the civil rights movement for political equality. And so what's really fascinating to study about this time period and these groups was this kind of contradiction that emerged. On the one hand, the narrative was about spontaneity, that they were going out and kind of doing their own thing. And like I said, this was occurring in the West Coast, right? That it appeared that things were kind of on their own, that people were not terribly well organized, versus the reality. The reality is you can't be that spontaneous without being very well organized. It can't be just a coincidence that everybody's got the same signs, they're saying the same chants, they're talking to the same media people, right? So they were in fact very organized, but the appearance in the narrative used language that said, this is spontaneous. And so scholars who are interested in this, we've looked in to see, so what's going on here? How do we understand this? And what it was that young people were making a break in language from what adult leaders were using, right? What older people were saying. They broke away from the traditions of how to organize, right? The adults, the older people were using a very hierarchical structure, right? One person's in charge, they report down the line, chain of command kind of thing. So young people broke away from that and started doing a much more horizontal kind of movement where people were sharing and making decision-making opportunities, and they were talking with each other. And this, of course, generated a different type of language, one of spontaneity, one that seemed that it was coming out of nowhere, that was sparking things. And this is what kind of creates the language that you often hear today about the suddenness of protests, even though they've been coordinated and well organized for months and sometimes years before you see these mass protests. But what these narratives do is they help people understand that on the one hand, what they're doing is going to be physically demanding, right? Marching, standing outside, sitting in. These are much more than putting Twitter hashtag out there. It's much more dedicated. But at the same time, it's also giving this sense of group unity, right? So those material benefits are going to be there for you, your security, your food. And that together you're going to be able to accomplish something that otherwise would be dangerous, and has a certain element of danger to it, but it's giving the sense that there's going to be people there for you. So I want to think about this then to an urgent problem in the New York City area, of which there are several lawsuits, but not very much political organizing in the mass protest or the mass social movement sense, like that we've just been talking about. And so there's this huge segregation problem, which is a violation of Brown versus Board of Education, among other legal cases. But you don't hear people talking about it a lot. And you actually find a lot of people are very confused, right? They say, well, it's a very diverse city, and so there's no problem. Or you'll hear people say, well, people choose to live next to each other. Some of that is, of course, true, right? But much of it is not true, right? So segregation is about the separation of wealthy white people from everybody else. And so when we say diversity, who we're always not talking about are wealthy white people. And so that's what makes it illegal, is the separation of wealthy white people from everybody else, not everybody else being together, living in poverty or lower middle class. So we have to start with this, language issue from the very beginning, is we have to think about, well, what qualifies as diverse, right? When are we saying diversity is representative? When are we saying that diverse is equal? Otherwise, we're getting dangerously into the language of separate but equal, and that's a violation of the legal agreements that we've come to with over the last 100 years since the 14th Amendment. The other thing is really trying to unpack race, ethnicity, and culture, and understanding that those things are not the same thing, and understanding also that people are going to experience those things differently. So somebody who's African American might have a different experience than somebody who's a recent immigrant from Jamaica. They may have the same experience. If they're wealthier, they might have a similar experience to a Latina from Brazil who's enjoying privilege as well, that they've got money that they're using to kind of acclimate to the educational experience here. So maybe they're going to NYU. You also want to think about gender and sexuality. Are these identities treated equally in every space? Are they treated better, or do they have more resources in other places? And then obviously you want to think about class. Is it a coincidence that at institutions in Brooklyn, at college education institutions, where you have large amount of Black and Hispanic students, you also have a large amount of poverty? And what is the government doing about that? And so isn't this, at the end of the day, right, just a situation of we're separate but unequal? So nothing has really changed, even though the 14th Amendment prohibits this exact situation, and the Supreme Court ruled this was unconstitutional in Brown versus Board of Education. We haven't done anything, right? So where's the social movement? So what has changed over time, space, is the ideology, the narrative. People believe that there's equality, they believe there's diversity, and so they start acquiescing, they start accepting the domination, they start accepting the separation and the segregation. And so how do you get people to start organizing and changing the language? So one idea is that maybe social scientists are wrong, right? Maybe there's these what we call hidden transcripts. Maybe people in Brooklyn are in fact talking about this, but maybe they're doing it at their local restaurants or in a bodega or at their workplaces or in their churches or in their mosques, right? Maybe this is where these conversations are happening and we just don't have access to them because they're not protesting in the streets or they're not making political demands up in Albany or at City Hall. But we also want to then start collecting that information from where people are, right? And we start to think, do they recognize this problem as a rights-related problem? In other words, do you believe you have the right to an equal education, right? If you don't believe that, then you're not going to turn it into a rights issue, right? If you don't believe you have that right, you're not going to try to activate it. If you do believe you have the right to an equal education, which will lead to a better job, a better future, a house, all those things that people want, can you identify the rights violator? Can you find out who's keeping you from having this right? Can you identify who should be offering the protection, who should remedy this, who should make the change? And then after you do those two things, do you actually organize with other people to make a rights claim, to say, I have a right, you have the responsibility to enforce this right, now do so. Do you do those three things? So this tends to happen in 4 different ways. One is uncoordinated, so people believe they have a right and they're maybe posting something on Instagram and it's not saying like meet me at City Hall Thursday at 3 p.m. and let's protest our right. It's more like I have a right to an equal education. And so that's not very formal, right? It's mostly hidden. It's not really organizing with other people. Sometimes it's more coordinated. So you join a group, right? Maybe on Facebook, and you're posting things on your wall that's similar to what other people are posting on their wall. So you're coordinated, but it's still pretty hidden, right? Again, you're not really out in the public. Probably nobody outside your group is looking at your Facebook posts. And again, it's mostly informal. It's not using the legal system to make a change. Then there's uncoordinated, but they're open and they could be formal, like people are getting kicked out of, I'm thinking of Flatbush Tenants Association, for example, people getting unfairly evicted in areas in the Flatbush area, and so they seek out this group. So it's not terribly coordinated, right? People are only finding out each other once they get evicted, and they're trying to work with a group that's coordinated, and so then they have to have a discussion, but they're doing it kind of out in the open, right? They're protesting outside, they're staging a public display outside of the housing complex that they're being evicted from. Maybe they file a lawsuit, maybe they go to City Hall, maybe they show up at meetings at their church or at a union hall, right? So they're kind of starting to have more activity. And then finally, you see something like the ACLU, right, which is very coordinated and it's open, right? They've got a lot of different activities going on, putting a lot of pressure on the legal system, and those tend to break into formal, bringing lawsuits, putting pressure on the political system, but then also, putting together an educational campaign, a Know Your Rights campaign, or more kind of public-facing interviews, things like that, where they're trying to get the word out. And then, so to think about this in the future, right, and this is what the reading was really talking about in your reader in the Socio-Legal Approach to Constitutional Law on pages 114 to 130, and I'm going to apply these 4 themes that they come up with to my predictions of the future. So internationalization, you're going to see larger and larger social movements because of climate change refugees, right? Climate change is having an effect on so many different poor communities in the world, and so they really don't have a choice but to start organizing and starting social movements. And these have already begun. Some good examples are the Maldives, and also some of the climate change refugees coming up from Central America. Again, these are mostly uncoordinated and hidden, right? So they don't necessarily have the means to file lawsuits. They don't necessarily have the means to be able to to start these big public campaigns. So you might not know that a lot of the refugees coming from Central America are due to climate change, but you might look at the drought that caused the coffee problem, right? So that they weren't able to create coffee beans, that then takes away jobs, then people can't live in the area, then they have to move into a different area, then you have not enough people, or not enough housing, and then you've got too many jobs, and you've got political violence, right? These things are all connected to each other. Same thing with the Maldives, is I'm losing my island because of sea level rise. I have to go somewhere else. Somewhere else might not want me. This creates a political conflict. And so you have more and more of these local problems becoming global problems. Another example within that is the stateless population. There's now over 1 billion people. That's 1/9 of the, so 10% of the human population now does not have state representation, meaning they have no state to go to. The largest group of these people are the Rohingya, who were forced to leave their home country and now are all over Europe, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Africa. And as you see, they're spreading, right? They're getting further and further away, and 1 billion people is a lot of people. It's the largest mass migration movement in human history. So, this is going to be harder and harder because countries don't have ways of accepting people who don't have a passport or don't have papers. And so people who have been excluded from governments have a hard time. And so for Jewish people who are excluded from a wide variety of countries, multiple times throughout history, but most recently during World War I and II, a bunch of the Western countries had to come together and create a process for these stateless Jewish people to become recognized in different governments. And so this is it requires a lot of organization, and so you'll see social movements putting forward these things. In fact, you can see the United Nations already has a campaign with a couple movie stars that are talking about the stateless situation and then climate change refugees. The other issue is the decline of democracy. And so you see the big lie in the United States that Trump actually won the election, but that's not the only place. This has happened actually multiple times in history as well in other countries. It's happening right now in Brazil, happening in other countries. I mean, Iran uses this pretty consistently. Putin has used this strategy in the past. And so what this does is it undermines the belief that elections are fair, and so of course people stop voting, right? And so when people start voting, then you have a much more authoritarian system. And so, this is a pretty classic example of decline of democracy. People stop believing in the institutions. The other issue is economic decline, right? As you have a pandemic like we had, you're going to have economic decline. There's no way to avoid it. But people start, because they don't believe in the institutions, because they think politicians are lying, or they believe in these various conspiracies, then we don't have any place for people to compromise or come to any agreements about how to manage economic decline. So things get worse, people get more upset, and so you're going to see more social movements, both for and against the big lie, and many social movements will be generated from economic decline. And sometimes these will clash, and sometimes they'll overlap. So you have a lot of people who lost their blue-collar jobs in the Midwest. They believe in the big lie. Then you have other people who've lost their tourist jobs in, say, Haiti. They're protesting against economic decline. They don't care about the big lie. And so you see these things kind of working themselves out. Professionalization is going to continue to be a pattern, I think. You're going to see this because people with elite education, people go to Harvard, Yale, things like that. Because of economic decline, they are less likely to go into a finance job, to a Wall Street job, and they're more likely to take a bureaucratic job like the State Department, or start a nonprofit, or work for a nonprofit. And so that's the viewpoint that is going to run those nonprofits, or people from elite backgrounds. So they're going to have a very different way of socially organizing than poor people would, or people from a middle class background. And this is going to make it harder and harder for social movements to compete with larger nonprofit organizations who are good at fundraising and maybe don't have very big followings, but they have a lot of money. And you're going to see this kind of going with bureaucracy because you've still got countries, you've still got states, and so you kind of see wealthy people negotiating with wealthy people on behalf of poor people and people with injustice claims. This will be hard to break, right? unless you see kind of the strategy of the sit-ins from young people. So young people are the ones who'd have to break this pattern. And then finally, there's triumph. If you wanted to see this work, or what social movements would actually look in, you'd be abolishing police-enforced capitalism, which is really what defund the police, abolition, and anti-capitalists are about. It's not abolishing the police, as in no one in your neighborhood is going to keep crime out. It's abolishing this particular system of police and replacing it with a different system of police, which requires some imagination, some research, and some political will, which a lot of people are, just to be blunt, not interested in finding out information that is different than what they already believe. And so, as the reading says, this is probably unlikely. It's not impossible because of the things that are causing the pressure. These big global and national problems are requiring a change to occur, but actually a full change of the system is probably unlikely. But then finally, if we want to see this all together, then what we'd really be asking is, as these four futures are kind of emerging, how many people start to take on the narrative of up against the law, and that's where you'll see more street protests, more public campaigns, media, social media efforts, and then how many people tend to see it with the law. You'll start to see people try to use the court system. The environmental movement is very aggressive with using the court system these days, and really trying to change constitutions and passing laws in different states. And so that's an interesting use of with the law. The ACLU has been more aggressive with bringing legal cases against the abuse of police abuse against people of color in America. The other thing is, you'll have to, we all have to wonder, and you'll have to think about this for your own self. There's value in the uncoordinated, hidden, mostly informal ways of organizing. And that's really what we meant by the sit-ins were represented as this change, right? A change from the bureaucratic, a change from the current uses of the legal system, and a current way of organizing based on top-down kind of chain of command approach. And so how do those groups move from uncoordinated to coordinated, and how do they move from informal to formal, right? And in what ways do they become more open? Those are the big questions that we'd want to think about for the future of social movements as they use law and they fight for their rights. And then finally, just to think about that, when we think about the big issues right now in constitutional law, we'd have to think about excessive use of force by police. So what rights do people of color have when encountering police officers? What rights do women have in their own reproductive health? What rights do people have in enforcing voting procedures in their states and in their local jurisdictions? What rights do people have to protect them from being poisoned by plastics or natural gas or pollution, right? And having access to clean water. These are all issues. What rights do people have? I guess I shouldn't forget to be protected by the seem unfettered sales of guns to apparently anyone who wants one. What rights do people have to own guns and defend themselves? What rights do people have to property or to get a mortgage, to get a home? What rights do people have to resist getting vaccinated or to send their kids to a school that doesn't teach evolution, right? What rights do people have? Again, we want to think about, well, what do we know about the historical struggle of rights? We've seen all of these. There was anti-vaxxers before with the Spanish flu in the 1900s. There were people who were against critical race theory when slavery was abolished in the 1800s, right? So these are not new problems. So we want to look and see what has happened in the past. And then how do they use the courts or not use the courts? We shouldn't be surprised that as long as you have police-enforced capitalism, that we still have racial and class exploitation and gender exploitation, right? The largest group of human trafficking are young girls. Women still don't get equal pay in most jobs, and we still continue to treat immigrants as second-class citizens in the economic sphere. And so we're going to keep having these problems as long as the context stays the same. How do people talk about these struggles? How do people talk about these rights? A fascinating case was the Amazon and Starbucks unionizing campaigns across the country, and largely beginning in Staten Island. People were using that example to frame how they were going to think about their own struggles in their own areas, and try to organize to get better pay and better treatment and sick days and all those things that people believe that they have the right in the workplace. And then how does this inform practices in New York? How does this change things in Florida, things like that? And then again, going back to these big global and national changes, you're very likely to see a big political change in the next 2 years in this country. What kind of opportunities then are put forward for people to organize? So these are the kind of things you want to think about with social movements, and why and how do they decide to fight for their rights, and how does this inform how they think about what law is in their everyday life.